It began like any wedding in the genteel circles of Virginia's old plantations, with the flicker of candlelight across silver chalices and the low hum of a string quartet playing softly in the background. The guests had gathered in their finest attire on that spring evening of 1847, the scent of magnolia wafting in through open parlor windows, the air alive with the promise of new beginnings. But before the vows could be toasted, before the ink on the marriage license was even dry, something happened that turned celebration into legend. As laughter rippled around the long oak table, the bride herself rose to return a toast. For a heartbeat, her beauty seemed untouchable, her voice steady, and then as wine touched her lips, her body went rigid. A gasp, a tremor, and in seconds, she collapsed lifeless onto the floor. Silence swallowed the hall. Shock rippled like wildfire, and so began a whispered story that would haunt Virginia for generations. What killed her that night? Who knew the secret before she fell? And why was the entire house, within months, abandoned and bricked shut, its walls never again to echo with music or love? Before we uncover the chilling truth, let me ask you, if you crave stories that history tried to erase, if you want to delve deeper into the shadows of the past with me, then subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. This story is only just beginning. They called her Margaret Hale, though in the letters discovered years later, her name was often inked more delicately as Maggie. 17 years old and just on the edge of adulthood, she had the kind of beauty that painters tried to capture yet always betrayed with faint exaggeration. Witnesses who saw her on that fateful day described her pale skin as almost luminous against the ivory lace of her wedding dress. Her dark hair had been woven with pearls and pinned high, though a few strands slipped rebelliously at the sides. She was, in the words of one guest, a living angel, gliding through the hall with eyes that promised joy and sorrow rolled into one. Her groom, Thomas Radcliffe, was 10 years her senior, an ambitious planter's son whose family had risen from modest beginnings into the ranks of local aristocracy. He was handsome in a hardened way, respected for his wit and feared for his temper. To marry Margaret was to cement his reputation, for her family carried influence older than Virginia's own statehood, tracing back to colonial proprietors and whispers of land acquired not always by honest means. The marriage was as much an alliance as it was a romance, or so many of the guests would later claim. The wedding itself was held on the Hale estate, a sprawling home of brick and gables that overlooked a wide bend of the James River. The house was known for its grand oak dining hall, and on that April evening, candles crowded the mantels, casting strange shadows across the guests' faces. The feast was lavish. Roasted pheasant, venison, fruits imported from Charleston, and wine said to have been shipped from Bordeaux itself. It was noted that the family spared no expense, as though determined to lay a foundation of grandeur for what should have been a promising union, and then, the moment no one ever forgot. Margaret raised her glass. The guests leaned forward, eager to hear her words, but she barely spoke before her body convulsed. Her wedding gown crumpled against the polished wood, her white-gloved hands trembling before falling still. In less than a minute, her skin lost its glow. Her lips seemed to darken as if stained by something far fouler than wine. She exhaled one rattling breath, then no more. By the time the groom reached her side, she was gone. Panic erupted. One servant dropped the platter he carried. The crash of porcelain froze the entire hall. The mother's shriek was described as piercing, animal-like. Guests rushed toward the body, their finery smeared by spilled wine and the shudder of overturned chairs. Some begged for a doctor, others for a priest, and all eyes eventually turned to the groom. But Thomas Radcliffe only stared, silent and pale, one hand rooted to the edge of the table. Later accounts conflicted about his face. Some said it showed nothing but shock, wide-eyed disbelief. Others whispered that there was something harder there, a strange calm beneath the turmoil, as though he knew what had happened or had expected it. Within hours, the tragedy was confirmed. The bride was dead, lifeless at 17, her body untouched by struggle, yet marked by something no ordinary affliction could explain. No bites, no wounds, no external signs of violence. The family physician arrived and could only shrug helplessly. He described her skin as eerily smooth, drained of warmth, with only a faint shadow upon the lips betraying the truth. He refused to speculate publicly, though years later it emerged in his hidden notes. This was no fainting, no fever, no natural malady. This was an intrusion, When daylight broke, Margaret's body was carried upstairs to the guest chamber where the curtains were drawn and the windows latched. Her dress, still stained by wine and dark blotches no one could quite identify, was carefully folded away and locked in a cedar chest. Servants reported that her father, Elias Hale, refused to leave the chamber. He sat by her bedside through the night, clutching a silver cross that trembled between his hands, whispering prayers that grew frenetic by dawn. Some said he was not asking for her return, but for protection, for her soul, or perhaps for his own. The wedding guests quickly scattered, unwilling to linger in the house that had turned from a place of joy to a tomb. But they carried with them pieces of the story, fragments of rumor, observations that would drift through letters and diaries for decades. Why did Thomas Radcliffe not weep? Why did Elias Hale speak of debts that no one else understood? And why were the servants forbidden from stepping foot in Margaret's chamber after her death? Those strange noises were said to echo from the locked room at night. The official records are sparse. The marriage license was filed. The death certificate, issued hastily, listed sudden consumption of the lungs. But no one who had seen the collapse believed it. Consumption does not strike like lightning. It does not twist a girl's face in seconds, nor leave her body cold before the wine has dried upon the floor. The whispers quickly turned darker. Some said it was poison, slipped into her glass, jealousy rooted in wealth and inheritance. Others spoke of a family curse, one that was ancient and unbroken. A rumor hinted that Margaret had long been ill, that her beauty concealed frailty. But another theory, more chilling, spread in the taverns and among whispering neighbors. They said the Hale family trafficked in unfinished bargains, old debts whispered in the dead of night. They hinted that Elias Hale had gained his wealth not only from land but from something far older that could not be bought in coin. And that night, in his eagerness to see his daughter wed, the debt had been collected. 2 weeks after the funeral, the Hale estate was shuttered. Servants dismissed with stipends for their silence. Thomas Radcliffe moved to his family home and never remarried. And the brick house on the James stood empty, its parlor windows shuttered, the dining hall forever silent. Yet even from a distance, locals claimed they could see figures moving across the windows, flickers of a bride's shape caught carrying her glass, rising once more to toast eternity. When the house was finally demolished decades later, among its foundations, workers found a trunk bound in leather. Inside was a collection of letters, diaries, and one sealed envelope in Elias Hale's hand. Scrawled on the back were words that still chill the eye. "Do not break this seal, lest you are prepared to share her fate." The envelope had been slit open long ago, but its pages had crumbled to dust. What secrets it contained, no one could say. What remains are fragments, the outlines of a darker truth. To this day, one question lingers like a ghost. What killed Margaret Hale that night? And why was her story buried as quickly as her body? What if the truth was more than a tragic coincidence? What if her death was not merely the end of a girl, but the beginning of something larger, a warning of what happens when wealth, desperation, and secrets collide? The deeper you look, the more the tale feels less like a mystery of one family and more like a conspiracy, reaching far beyond a single night. As though her fall at the wedding table was the visible crack in a hidden structure. And if you follow that crack, if you look closer, you begin to see the foundation upon which the Hale wealth truly stood. Because Margaret's death was not the first tragedy in that house, nor was it the last. Letters now faded speak of other illnesses, other sudden collapses, events swept away and forgotten by design. Like a map unfolding, the more we trace those deaths, the closer we come to understanding what really happened on that April night. And though the official records are sparse, there are enough fragments left in journals, enough whispers passed down through the generations, to piece together a far more terrifying story than anyone dared to write at the time. The question, however, is whether you're prepared to hear it. Because once you step past the thin veil of weddings and candlelight, you enter a world where families bargain with the unnameable, where beauty is conserved at a monstrous price, and where love is only ever a mask for hunger. And in that world, Margaret Hale's sudden collapse is not a tragedy. It is a consequence. The price finally is being paid. The story of Margaret Hale cannot be fully understood without stepping back into the roots of the Hale family itself, a lineage marked by ambition, war, and an almost unnatural appetite for survival. In Virginia society of the 18th and early 19th centuries, no family rose without sacrifice. But what haunted neighbors about the Hales was not that they grew, but how swiftly and how ruthlessly they seemed to do it. Climbing from obscurity into prominence in a fraction of a generation, the Hale patriarch, Jonathan Hale, arrived in Virginia in the wake of the Revolution, a man whose origins remain shrouded in mystery. Some say he had been a merchant out of London who abandoned debt so deep that his name was whispered with curses upon the docks. Others claimed he was a runaway soldier who deserted under the cover of fog and managed to cross the Atlantic. What is certain is that by 1795, he owned more land than men who had fought and bled for the Revolution. How did a man, with no known fortune and no allies, acquire acres of fertile riverside property while established? Neighbors struggled to rebuild their lives. When pressed, Jonathan Hale would speak only of agreements and alliances. However, as the decades passed, it became apparent that his alliances extended not only to men. While the other planters of the region endured plagues of insects, fire, and failed harvests, the Hale fields thrived. Even in seasons when blight blackened the countryside, the corn and tobacco stalks on Hale land stood tall and lush, immune to the plague that was eating its way across neighboring farms. Curious, some said. Others used darker words, unnatural. And then there were the deaths. Workers in his household, servants bound to the estate, fell mysteriously ill. Not in droves, but in ones and twos. Enough so that no one could accuse a pattern, yet too often to ignore. Fever came upon them suddenly in the night. By morning, they would lie pale as milk. It was said Hale himself ordered their burials to be swift, with no priest summoned, no families notified. "Do not linger on the dead," he was heard to mutter. "The land remembers what we have given it." When Jonathan himself died in 1811, his son Elias inherited land so inexplicably fertile that banks lined up to extend him credit. Elias was respected as a gentleman, yet feared for his moods. Visitors remarked on his tendency to wander the estate grounds at night, candle in hand, whispering prayers into the soil as though negotiating with it. It was therefore no surprise when Elias became known for hosting gatherings that stretched into the early hours. Salons of philosophy where occult pamphlets imported from Europe were read aloud alongside scientific tracts. He was less a farmer than a student of arcane balance sheets, always calculating, always bartering with unseen ledgers. It was Elias who gave birth to Margaret, the only daughter out of 7 children. Strange it was, too, that while his sons were sickly and several died young, Margaret seemed untouched by illness, radiant, vigorous, as though her father's bargains concentrated around her alone. "She is the jewel," Elias once said. "She is the promise." But promise for whom, and at what cost? Guests who stayed at the Hale estate reported seeing items that troubled them, small, locked chests in which soil was kept damp year-round, laden with stains that looked like blood on the lids. Bones of animals buried near the river were unearthed by floodwaters, carefully arranged in towers behind the smokehouse. Servants whispered that voices echoed from the boarded cellar at night, voices no one had entered to create. But Elias silenced such talk with payments, generous stipends that kept mouths closed and eyes blind. By the time Margaret came of age, the estate carried whispers of a curse and a gift intertwined. Her beauty was luminous, but unnatural. Her skin never blemished, her hair never dulled in the sun. She seemed almost preserved, more sculpture than flesh, and those who knew her closely worried that at times she appeared less joyful than resigned, as if she sensed the weight of invisible chains laid across her destiny. In this light, her match to Thomas Radcliffe seemed simultaneously strategic and desperate. For Thomas was not merely a groom, but a creditor. The Radcliffe family had long eyed the Hale fortune. The union promised to solidify wealth on both sides, but more urgently, it pledged to distract from the hollowing of the Hale household. While Elias posed as a gentleman of means, letters preserved indicate his coffers were strained. He owed debts he could never repay, not financial ones, but older, darker obligations. And as folklore tells us, debts not paid with coin are paid with flesh. The months leading up to the wedding were unusual in other ways as well. Several servants fled without explanation. 2 workers vanished entirely, their belongings left behind. Margaret herself seemed pale and distracted, often seated at her dresser for hours staring into the mirror, as though waiting to recognize the face reflected. On one occasion, according to her childhood companion, she confessed in a trembling whisper, I feel watched. He has promised something, and I must pay. But pressed on the meaning, she said no more. The night of the wedding itself, neighbors had gathered not only for joy but out of curiosity, for the Hale estate had long been closed to public merriment. The chandeliers lit rooms that had been untrodden for years, and the luster of unused silver created an atmosphere both monumental and uncanny. Some guests felt discomfort even before the collapse, noting that despite the laughter, the air in the dining hall had a strange stillness, like a church before the arrival of the coffin. But it was after Margaret's sudden fall that everything came unstitched. Elias, witnesses recalled, whispered a phrase repeatedly over her body. Not English, but something foreign, almost chant-like. He held her hand and said not, "Wake," but "Restore." Servants who dared to linger swore her eyes fluttered even in death, and her lips curved almost as though to respond. But then, silence took her, undeniable and eternal. No one could forget the emptiness of Thomas Radcliffe's face, his lack of tears. For in later years he was suspected of having known, of having married into the Hale fortune not for love, but because he too was party to the debt. Perhaps his pact was not with Margaret but with her father, an exchange of loyalty for power. Or possibly, as some speculated, he had expected Margaret's end, that hers was always to be the ransom paid to settle the account. By summer, the Hale house was a tomb, and for all the family's prominence, no further public events were hosted on its grounds. The Hales had vanished as swiftly as they had risen. But as generations passed, the story resurfaced in new forms. A bride's ghost appearing in mirrors, a gown that reeked of sulfur though untouched by hand, footsteps echoing in the collapsed ballroom long after the roof gave way. The most startling record comes from a young student in 1872, who, while exploring the archives at the University of Virginia, discovered a crumbling volume entitled The Ledger. Scribbled within were fragmented accounts of land transfers and harvests, each entry written not in pounds or shillings but in terms disturbingly bound to lives. Debt collected, 2 taken. Debt deferred 3 years, 7 promised. The handwriting, though aged, bore unmistakable resemblance to that of Elias Hale, as confirmed by examples still held in county registries. If this ledger was genuine, it was no financial tome but a contract with something unspoken, something that fed, bargained, measured not in wines or harvests, but in souls. And if Margaret's name appeared there, it would answer why her wedding night ended not in consummation, but in collapse. Piece by piece, the tale of 1847 transformed from tragedy into revelation. Margaret had not merely died, she had been claimed, and her father's frantic attempts to restore her suggested he believed she could still be bargained back, as though her beauty, her body, her innocence were negotiable commodities on an invisible market. By re-examining the fragments of Margaret's story, the sealed trunks, the panicked father, the silent groom, we no longer see a young bride consumed by accident. We see a victim of a transaction. Her collapse was the tallying of a larger account, a reminder that certain debts, once entered into, are never forgotten. It is easy to consign tales like these to folklore and exaggeration, to pass them off as Gothic embellishments layered upon a sad but ordinary collapse. But why then the secrecy? Why destroy so many records? Why exile servants? Why brick the house? Unless the story of Margaret Hale touched on something larger, something that certain men still feared the public might glimpse. And that is where the rumblings of conspiracy take root. Fouler secrets than poison or family madness. Secrets that speak of societies hidden within the parlors of the antebellum South. Men who traded not only in land and tobacco, but in knowledge pilfered from forgotten texts. Knowledge that promised to resist the one enemy no fortune ever conquered: time. What was Margaret Hale's role in this? To outsiders, she was a bride. To her family, she was an offering. Her collapse at the table was no senseless act of fate. It was the silence of a debt collector's hand, a moment that told every guest present. The bargain was still in effect. Elias Hale's house crumbled because his line had run out of children to offer. His fortune had grown on roots watered not by rain, but by blood. And his jewel, his daughter, had finally been demanded back by the powers he thought he could control. The chilling implication is this, and it will guide us into what follows. Margaret's death was not the end of the Hale story. It was the point at which that story connected to others. to families of power in Petersburg, across Virginia, and even further north. Because the ledger found years later hints at more than one debtor, it suggests that the same terms bound more than one family. To understand Margaret's fall, we must ask, who else was paying? Who else was promised? And who among the powerful quietly bought their seats at history's table with the silence of vanished brides and vanished sons? The whispers surrounding the Hale mansion did not end with the dismantling of its blackened foundation. In fact, it was only after the family vanished from polite society that neighbors began to speak more freely, each recalling fragments that, when pieced together, painted a picture of something far larger than one fateful night in 1847. These conversations, recorded decades later in journals and contained in odd clippings from regional newspapers, reveal a chilling pattern. Margaret's death was not an isolated event. It was part of a chain, a recurring fracture in a system designed to stay hidden. You see, the Hales were not alone. They were one spoke on a wheel whose hub was something far more deliberate, something that spread silently across the social and political arteries of Virginia. Letters that survived from Elias Hale's circle named familiar men: Radcliffes, Fenwicks, Lawsons, families whose fortunes ballooned in improbable ways during periods when others struggled. At almost the same rate their crops thrived, rumors sprouted that wives slipped into illness like candle flames snuffed by unseen hands. Daughters abruptly disappeared from the public eye. Sons were spoken of as delicate and fragile until suddenly there was no mention of them in local gazettes at all. The most damning connection came from an anonymous broadside, circulated in Richmond in 1851. Styled in the language of satire, it mocked a group of gilded Brahmins who supposedly gathered in secret lodges by torchlight. But biting jokes often hide sharper truths. The piece described rituals in which the clock was stopped, brides stood as symbols of continuity, and harvests were carried out not to God but to the drowned king. Though crude, this pamphlet echoed too perfectly what had been whispered of the Hales. When compared with later findings, especially the crumbling ledger thought to be Elias's own, it becomes increasingly likely these practices were not eccentric rumors but fragments of an organized fellowship, an informal society bound by the belief that time itself could be manipulated if certain sacrifices were made. In effect, their wealth and longevity were not products of nature, but rather the result of deliberate extraction. Consider this. In the year following Margaret's death, the Radcliffe estate acquired nearly 500 acres of riverfront land that the Hales had mortgaged. The transfer was registered quietly, yet surged with significance. Was this a coincidence, or was it the spoils of the transaction? To some researchers, it was the closing of a deal in which a daughter's life became collateral for power, and the more one examines these eerie alignments, the deeper the chill spreads. In Petersburg, for example, records recount the sudden wedding and immediate death of one Susanna Fenwick in 1834, eerily similar to Margaret's fate. The newspaper of the day remarked only, "A most unfortunate episode marred a night of celebration." But in household ledgers preserved by descendants, the physician's notes mention skin drained to marble and an odd stillness in the watching eyes of Susanna's father, as though rehearsed acceptance had replaced grief. Move further southward, into North Carolina in the 1820s, and another echo emerges, a bride known only in memory as Rachel, wedded into the powerful Coiner family, collapsed at the altar itself before vows were completed. Her name evaporates from the public record after that day, yet the Coiners expanded their mercantile empire in the decade that followed, acquiring monopolies in tobacco distribution that eclipsed generations of rivals. Was it genius, or was it blood sealed with silence? Patterns like these appear random when isolated, but strung together they form a lattice. The lattice resembles not chance, but a system. And where there is a system, there is purpose. What was that purpose? The journals of observers like Dr. Whitlock Pierce, a physician tangentially linked to the Radcliffes, suggest an obsession not merely with retaining wealth, but with staving off decay. Disease, famine, and mortality, the three-headed hound that devoured the 19th century, were enemies to be bartered against. Pierce wrote cryptically of an understanding among gentlemen that what slips away from one house may lengthen the candle in another. He seemed convinced that vitality itself was transferable, if captured and preserved. That whispered scientific justification was enough to cushion what might otherwise be seen as inhuman. Men convinced themselves that in losing a daughter, an entire family line might endure. Blood became currency, and Margaret was one of the circulating coins. Now, pause for a moment. Before you dismiss these patterns as grim exaggerations filtered through the lens of grief and superstition, recall how ruthlessly the records were hidden. The whole family's archives disappeared. County registries reveal gaps in birth and death records. Newspapers that printed too much mysteriously burned in warehouse fires. It is not that there is too much evidence to be credible. It is that there is just precisely enough to prove someone has spent over a century erasing everything else. Erasure is rarely the mark of accident. It is the signature of power. By the time Elias disappeared from the public record, other members of his so-called gentleman's society had advanced onto larger stages. Judges shaping laws, bankers controlling credit lines, clergymen who somehow preached renewal while their wives wasted quietly in silence. What united them was not ideology but fear, the fear of loss, of decay, of surrender to time's indifferent blade. And they weren't merely preserving family fortunes. They seemed to believe they had harnessed something elemental, which brings us back to Margaret. If her collapse was the result of a debt, then she was not simply unlucky. She was chosen and groomed, protected, preserved from illness, not because her father loved her, but because she was an instrument in a darker game. Her bridal moment was never about celebration, but about timing. For what better stage to mark such a transaction than at the height of her beauty, before the eyes of every person who mattered in Virginia society? Her fall was a pageant. It demonstrated not just loss, but control. The bride does not just die, she is taken, and all who watch understand the consequences of breaking faith with the fellowship. If such a fellowship existed, what became of it? Local folklore insists it faded after the Civil War, swept away in the ruins of plantations and the destruction of a way of life. Yet those who study its traces contend otherwise. There is compelling reason to believe the fellowship adapted, shedding its ritual clothing but retaining its hunger. Instead of hushed toasts in river homes, it became dinner parties in Richmond townhouses. Instead of burning candles in oak halls, gentlemen gathered in chambers labeled Societies of Progress, their rhetoric cloaking the same unspeakable engine humming. Beneath, the last verifiable hint comes, again from the elusive ledger found in the ruins of Hale's home. Among the entries written in trembling hand, one line stands striking. Ode to the circle, one promised, one received. Balance carried forward. Not settled, not ended, but carried forward. A rolling debt, which points to one conclusion. Margaret's collapse was never an ending, nor even a beginning, but simply an installment. Somewhere deeper in the lattice, the circle, or whatever name these men called themselves, was still accounting, still watching brides raise their glasses, ensuring that a payment was received when the balance came due. And this thread leads us into questions still more disturbing. Did the Hale line end, or were its obligations merely dispersed into new hands, new families? Did Thomas Radcliffe become one of the keepers, carrying knowledge Elias could no longer bear? Did the Fenwicks and Lawsons follow suit? By tracing their fortunes, one sees continuities too sharp to ignore. Political influence is rising at an impossible speed. Diseases that had devoured their neighbors mysteriously spared their own homes. Heirs who remained vigorous when others at their age shrank to husks. If not sorcery, then at least science ahead of its time. The science of vitality stolen, redistributed, its true cost hidden behind pretty fictions. Pause once more and consider this. How many public figures in the decades that followed seemed to defy mortality, appearing ageless in portraits over spans of 20 years? How many times were sudden, unexplained deaths of young women brushed aside as fainting, fever, or womanly delicacy? Each could be a coincidence. Together they begin to resemble accounts in Elias's ledger, reborn chapter after chapter. And if you are shivering at the thought, if the idea that your ancestors may have toasted alongside demons disguised in gentlemen's coats chills you, remember this too. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend, because knowledge cannot be hoarded, it must be spread, or else the silence devours us all. The fellowship, or circle, or society of preservation, whatever name it wore, did not die. It did what all predators do. It adapted. It buried itself deeper, and it waits. Margaret's pale hands clawed nothing that night, but her story claws still. Every toast raised at every wedding, every sudden collapse, every disappearance of a young wife, These are echoes, repetitions, unpaid balances drawn across generations of whispered bargains. Whether you believe in curses, conspiracies, or coincidences, you cannot ignore the connecting thread. Power purchased with lives too young to be lost. Lives like Margaret's. To follow those echoes is to step into a labyrinth. And deeper yet inside that labyrinth, as we will soon see, stands a chamber. A room where men tallied debts not with numbers but with names. Where a bride's collapse was not fate but design, that room's remnants still exist in letters and records, if one dares to look. And when we enter it, as we will in our next step, we come face to face not only with the ghosts of Virginia's high society, but perhaps with the machinery of time itself, wound and rewound with the lives of daughters promised long ago. Imagine, if you will, a room with no windows, lit only by the flickering glow of candle stubs balanced in tarnished holders. The air is damp, faintly perfumed with the scent of mold and iron. At its center rests a table, not of stone or oak, but of something older, worm-eaten, scarred by knives, etched with grooves that repeat themselves like obsessive prayers. Around it gather men draped not in robes of mysticism, but in coats of fine cut and velvet, a masquerade of civility overlaying something primal. Papers shuffle, chalices are raised, but beneath the veneer of scholarship, another conversation hums. This, the whispers insist, was the chamber where debts were counted. Every society that leaves its mark on history does so with symbols, and this one was no exception. Sealed in trunks later uncovered from ruined estates were scraps of parchment bearing repeated emblems. A serpent coiled upon itself, a circle devouring its own tail. Known across alchemy as the Ouroboros, here it was twisted, its center hollow, as if creating space for something trapped inside. It was not an eternity as a balance. It was an eternity of imprisonment. The whispered name, the circle of perpetuity. The men in this chamber, according to faded letters, called themselves stewards. Not masters, not magicians, stewards of time itself. For they believed time contained a current, a harvestable energy, that youth, beauty, vitality. These were not simple accidents of nature, but measurable fuels, fuels that could be siphoned and redirected by those who knew how. Their language dripped with commerce, credits, loans, transfers, and balances. It was no accident that the ledger found in Hale's ruins resembled account books. For them, life was currency. And like all currencies, it could be stolen, inflated, or devalued. How was it stolen? Eyewitness fragments give clues. One servant dismissed from the Fenwick household in 1832 spoke of thin iron boxes carried into parlors late at night. Inside, she insisted, came the singers, creatures unseen but heard, their sounds piercing glass as though voice was a blade. Another record mentions birds, such as the nightingale and the raven, living instruments whose cries served as catalysts in the siphoning process. Still others mention small cages veiled in cloth, carried like relics into rituals and placed near the head of chosen victims. Whether literal or symbolic, the repetition of sound suggests their bargain was as much acoustic as it was spiritual, a resonance binding vitality from one vessel into another. Consider Margaret's body on that wedding night. Guests saw no wounds, no poison, no symptoms of fever. What they saw was transference. In a moment, her laughter stilled, her glow extinguished. If the circle believed in harvest, then her fall was not death but disbursement. Her youth did not vanish, it moved elsewhere. Into her father, whose health surged inexplicably after her death. Into her groom, whose estate multiplied threefold. Into allies at that table who toasted and then prospered. Her collapse was not an ending but a transaction. The silent passing of her bloom into the hands of men who had written her fate years before. What haunts most, though, is not the occult machinery itself, but the psychology underlying it. Men terrified of loss, obsessed with control, convinced their privilege was not temporary but a sacred mandate. Their fear was so overwhelming that it eclipsed compassion. They did not see daughters and wives. They saw accounts to balance. Margaret was never Margaret in their eyes. She was credited. Her face was a mask for value, her pulse merely proof of what could be transferred. Historians writing much later, when they dared to broach the topic at all, referred coldly to these practices as exchange ideology, a destructive philosophy that treated mortality as negotiable. But in the moment, seated at their candlelit tables, the stewards surely believed themselves enlightened, for they couched their language in progress, in science, even in philanthropy. They were not devourers but preservers, they told themselves. By sacrificing the few, they preserved the many, namely themselves. What hypocrisy more elegant could there be than annihilating innocence while calling it stewardship? Inside that chamber, rituals had a rhythm. One fragment suggests the proceedings began with the extinguishing of clocks, as time itself was declared suspended. Next came the reading of names, those entered as debtors in the ledger and those offered as settlement. Chalices filled with wine were raised, though participants whispered Latin prayers instead of toasts. When the chosen moment arrived, the victim merely drank from or touched a cup that had been prepared beforehand. To the naked eye, nothing more happened, but to the circle, everything did. The song was struck, the balance settled, the life taken. How? Skeptics might argue it smelled of poison, cleverly disguised and timed. Yet accounts stress the unnatural speed, the radiant sheen upon victims' still faces, too different from ordinary toxicology. You may choose to disbelieve the supernatural elements. That is your right. And yet disbelief cannot explain the pattern. The repeated deaths, each occurring at moments of social significance, each followed by abrupt surges in fortune or influence among those close by. The chamber became less a ritual hall than a boardroom, where the equity of vitality was bartered like coin.
And Margaret Hale's wedding night was merely their grandest performance.
A public sealing of debt, artfully masked as accident, witnessed by every person whose silence would secure their own prosperity. Pause and imagine being one of those silent witnesses. Imagine raising your glass to toast a young woman's future and watching instead as she fell rigid before you. Would you scream and flee? Some did, but others stayed, unmoved, glass still quivering near their lips. Because for them it was not horror, it was reassurance. Proof that the circle's pact held steady. That time could be cheated once more, so that their own aging bones would be spared for another season. It is in this psychology that the fellowship's true monstrosity resides. Not in the devices, not in the birds or cages or chants, but in the humanity devoured willingly, rationalized into silence. Wealth was not enough. Not for Elias Hale, not for the Fenwicks, not for the Lawsons. They craved the impossible. To freeze the moment, to arrest beauty, to conquer death. And in chasing it, their legacy became a gallery of still portraits and empty graves. Margaret's story echoes because she was not alone, because hers was the most visible face of a pattern that stretches like ivy, tangling itself around the architecture of power in Virginia and beyond. Each transference left a trace, barely visible in the records, but undeniable when seen as part of the whole tapestry. And each ritual in that chamber was both payment and promise, resetting the ledger, renewing the illusion that time itself bent to their will. The chilling thought is this: if they learned to arrest vitality, even temporarily, then Margaret's death was not even permanent. What if the energy siphoned did not simply vanish but lingered, dispersed through vessels, waiting to be summoned again? What if her laughter, trapped like a butterfly pinned under glass, still echoes inside those who drank that night? In trying to freeze youth, they may have created ghosts, consciousnesses looping silently within timeless prisons. Did Elias Hale hear his daughter's voice in his ear at night, not as a memory but as an echo inhabitant? Did Thomas Radcliffe glance into mirrors and see not his own face but hers staring back, frozen at 17? These are speculations, but they match too closely the testimonies of servants who swore the house was not silent at night, who heard not creaks or rats but the distinct cadence of footsteps, of a girl laughing faintly in empty rooms, a trap not for the body, but for the soul. So Margaret was never simply the bride who died at her wedding. She became an emblem, a porcelain doll in a glass case curated by her family's bargains. That is why her gown was folded and locked away, not destroyed. It was not just a memory. It was a relic, perhaps even a vessel. And here lies the horror. These chambers, these ledgers, these rituals were not the eccentric delusions of one family. They were systematized, coordinated, and spread across households whose fortunes still cast shadows over our modern lives. The chamber of debt was replicated, refined, and hidden. A pattern that adapted, transformed, and spread into new disguises with each generation. For what is a ledger if not a prototype of modern contracts? What is a chamber if not the seed of boardrooms where vitality continues to be traded today, disguised in the sterile language of science and progress? What are missing daughters and unexplained collapses if not unpaid installments in an agreement still alive in our bloodstream? Margaret's story was the key. Her moment at the wedding table was the fracture through which the truth bled. The fellowship exists not in ruins, but in adaptation. And if we ever hope to understand its reach, we must follow the trail outward, into other regions, other families, other centuries. As the ledger itself stated, the balance was carried forward. The ruin of the Hale estate might suggest an ending, a clean severing of one family's pact with the circle of perpetuity. But history is not clean. Secrets do not vanish with the burning of houses any more than shadows vanish with the snuffing of candles. They are carried forward, attached like parasites to whatever living host comes next. And in the mid-19th century, the circle found new hosts. Beyond Virginia, beyond plantations, beyond the genteel world of riverside weddings. To understand this expansion, we must look at the decade that followed Margaret's collapse. While her family's fortune crumbled into silence, allies of the circle surged upward. A Radcliffe cousin became a state judge in Richmond, whose rulings consistently favored industries linked to the circle families. A Fenwick was appointed to oversee tariffs that miraculously benefited his own land interests. And, most tellingly, a Lawson cousin relocated to Philadelphia in 1853, where he founded what he styled a Society for the Scientific Study of Vital Renewal. On the surface, this appeared philanthropic. Its gatherings were open to intellectuals, its pamphlets spoke of progress, and its members praised each other as men of science. But dig deeper, and one finds the same symbols repeating, the serpent swallowing itself, the Ouroboros hollowed into imprisonment. The language of the society mirrored the ledgers of Elias Hale. Vitality, preservation, credits, balances. Only now they cloaked themselves in the garb of research instead of ritual. The move north was no accident. The Civil War was approaching. The South trembled under mounting tensions, and the circle understood survival required adaptation. If houses like Hale's collapsed in fire and ruin, the engine could not survive chained only to plantations. It needed a new cover, a new legitimacy. And what better cover than science, the rising language of the century? Letters surfaced in the 1870s from one Dr. Elias Price, a physician quietly expelled from the University of Pennsylvania, warning of peculiar experiments conducted at midnight in rooms he was barred from entering. He described patients suffering not from disease but cessations, their pulses suddenly halting, their eyes fixed, their energies appearing to be stolen. When he attempted to document this, his lectures were discredited, his name was erased from medical libraries, and his career was dissolved. The men he accused, wealthy industrialists tied to prominent circles in Philadelphia, would go on to endow hospitals, universities, and research foundations that are still admired today. Their public legacy is one of generosity. Their hidden story, whispered in Price's crumbling notes, is that they carried forth the exchange ideology disguised in benevolence. And this is where the greatest horror begins to take shape. Because from plantations to boardrooms, the philosophy never shifted. Life is currency. A bride, a patient, a debtor, it made no difference. Their vitality was collected, transferred, and reallocated. And the circle grew not smaller, but endless, feeding itself with the silence of those too afraid to challenge them. Continuing the connection further north, one finds evidence scattered across Boston, New York, and even into Canada. In Boston's Beacon Hill, the very neighborhood where families whispered about immortal wives never aging out of their salons, strange deaths mirrored Margaret's collapse. Brides vanished after rehearsal dinners. Heiresses were pronounced ill, quarantined, and never seen again. Even newspapers reported it in coded language. Miss So-and-so has entered a prolonged rest. Meanwhile, their families' fortunes quintupled overnight. The circle adapted its rituals into routines concealed within high society. Instead of ledgers hidden in plantation trunks, they became foundation charters. Instead of caged birds and chants, they employed laboratories and machines that calculated cellular integrity, but the substance of the act remained the same: preservation of some by the erasure of others. The chilling continuity is revealed most starkly in correspondence housed in New Haven archives. A letter from 1868 by a shipping magnate discusses with unsettling bluntness the principle of bloom. He writes, "The bloom appears most potent when extracted from youth at the moment of fullest vitality. The bloom is rich in daughters, preserved most naturally under the guise of weddings." He describes toasting rituals as a cover, masking the true purpose of timed collapses. And he signs the letter with a symbol you now recognize: serpent and hollowed Ouroboros. If bloom was their term for vitality, life itself in condensed essence, then Margaret's collapse was no mystery, no epidemic. It was the extraction of bloom. And if these words carried into northern foundations, then the circle was no relic of Virginian superstition. It was alive, calculating, expanding. In fact, financial logs from New York banking, houses between 1860 and 1900 reveal curious patterns. Immense donations made to research foundations in sudden tandem with an unexplained death in a benefactor's family. These connections were, of course, dismissed as a coincidence. But the persistence of coincidence is its own proof. Too many coincidences and you no longer have a chance. You have a design. Let us pause here for a moment. Reflect on what you are hearing. Families that shaped the very institutions we still trust, universities, hospitals, and charities, may have been built not on philanthropy, but on transference. Where we see donation and progress, perhaps we are only witnessing cover. The public mask of men feeding still upon bloom collected silently in back rooms. Remember how Margaret fell at a celebration, surrounded by toasts, her beauty stolen in an instant. Now imagine that not as a singular horror, but as the cornerstone of an empire. Imagine every merger, every research institute endowed, every sudden miracle of survival as an extension of that same principle. The circle did not just preserve its youth. They preserved their system. They did not just bargain away daughters. They bargained away morality itself. So when you walk the gilded halls of Ivy League campuses and marvel at centuries-old endowments, ask yourself, what was truly exchanged to seed that wealth? When you read about medical breakthroughs bankrolled by families whose names repeat endlessly in the pages of history, ask yourself, who was lost so that vital renewal could be purchased? Perhaps what chills the most is the thought that Margaret's fragment of bloom still circulates even now. Passed generation to generation, across the hands of those who fed at that table in 1847. Preserved in bloodlines that grow suspiciously ageless, in dynasties that seem never to fade, in prominent faces that weather poorly in rumor, but never visibly on their skin. The expansion north was not an expansion at all. It was metastasis. The circle grew as all cancers grow, silently, invisibly, drawing sustenance from whatever veins would feed it. And wherever it went, disappearances followed. Bodies that did not leave graves, brides that did not leave wedding nights, patients that did not leave wards. Always written as sudden illness, tragic accident, strange but unremarkable. Always erased but never absent. The same ledger terminology persisted even in modern updates, though disguised. Balance sheets spoke of seed investments. Reports referred to sustenance donations. These were linguistic adaptations, words designed to mean one thing to accountants and another to those who remembered Margaret's collapse. To them, balance carried forward was not fiscal, it was vital. Flowed not from coffers but from veins. And here lies the terror still gnawing at the edges of truth. That Margaret's story was not the story of one bride in 1847, but the story of a system that still hums beneath our civilization. If foundations were its disguise, then perhaps they still hum now. The same hunger wearing prettier coats. Brides no longer collapse at weddings because the circle has refined discretion. But if you look closer at medical headlines, financial windfalls, fortunes passing through unbroken across centuries, there it is again. Bloom, harvested and fed forward. They called themselves stewards. They claimed to preserve, but what they preserved was not humanity. It was secrecy. And while Margaret's death cracked open the door long enough for whispers to escape, the circle carried her silence north, encoded it into institutions, and presented it back to us dressed as benevolence. That mask still smiles today. Every system of power, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves cracks. And through those cracks, sometimes we can hear the voices of the broken. For the circle of perpetuity, those stewards who bartered lives for longevity, those cracks take the form of letters smuggled out in desperation, priest confessions whispered under threat, and fragments of testimonies written in trembling script that most never intended to survive. If Margaret Hale's collapse was the most public, it was only the spark of a much larger silence, for she was not alone. Take the letter of Clara Mills, a servant in the Fenwick household in 1835. Preserved only because her descendants tucked it inside a Bible until 1911, her testimony is staggering. The girl Susanna, Clara writes, was fair and eager, her eyes bright upon her wedding night. She smiled at us all, and then she fell, her hands grasping the table once and then nothing more. Master Fenwick told us it was her nerves, that her nature was delicate. But I swear upon the Holy Mother that her lips whispered, "Father promised me," before her breath ended. No doctor came, the doors were locked, and by morning the master rode with a vigor I had never seen, as though youth entered him again. That letter was never supposed to be seen. Other servants were silenced with money or with fear. Clara escaped only because she fled to a cousin's farm that very night. She left her wages, her belongings, everything. In her testimony, her horror is clear, not only at the sudden death, but at the knowledge that her master was less shocked than expectant that he knew. That Susanna's collapse was not a misfortune, but the fulfillment of a bargain. Another piece of surviving evidence comes from Rachel Coyner's cousin in North Carolina. In 1824, Rachel collapsed at the altar before completing her vows. The cousin Rebecca wrote privately, "When they carried her body away, I saw upon her gown not the scatter of earth, but faint dust, shimmering as though powdered glass. I touched it, and it stung my fingers like heat, and her eyes open, wide, not dead but trapped, as though she could see yet could do nothing. They closed them quickly, and the priest warned silence." What strikes modern readers is not only her description of shimmer and sting, hints of some catalyst in the powder marking transference, but also the psychological toll it left on Rebecca. She never married, never trusted. She feared every smile, every courtship, knowing behind it lurked the shadow of exchange. The secret denied Rachel her cousin's love decades later, stealing joy from those who survived. Then there is Margaret herself. Though she left no letter, fragments suggest she sensed her fate. A diary entry discovered in a deteriorated condition among the Hale family papers suggests a dreadful resignation. "Father walks the halls at night, speaks to shadows I cannot see. He calls them friends, protectors, stewards. They demand something. They will have it, and he looks at me with sorrow and pride, as though I were both treasure and payment. I pretend to sleep, but hear him repeat, 'She will shine once,' and at that moment the balance will hold. I do not wish to shine if shining means ending." Those words, if authentic, suggest that Margaret was not merely a victim, but a prisoner of foreknowledge. She understood that her father's bargains had marked her, and she realized that her marriage was not her new life, but her end. And imagine the psychological terror of walking down that aisle knowing your beauty was your ransom, your vitality already calculated into someone else's ledger. When she rose to toast, her face may well have trembled not with surprise but with dread. Documents further suggest that some mothers protested against this cycle, yet were tragically silenced. In Philadelphia, around 1864, Anna Lawrence confronted her husband, accusing him of endangering their daughter, Eleanor. A private letter from Anna to her sister survives. He speaks of preservation, of gifts given to us, but I see the lines in his face vanish even as hers deepen with fatigue. Eleanor is fading, and he thrives. I told him this is no miracle but theft. He swore me to silence with threats not spoken but clear. Weeks later, Anna was declared insane, confined to a private asylum owned by benefactors of her husband's circle. Eleanor died at 16. Her father went on to fund laboratories at the university, praised for his vision. And Anna? She died 2 years later in confinement. This is the recurring pattern. Victims erased, doubters silenced, bargain keepers rewarded. And across each story, the psychological horror resonates not just in the act of collapse, but in the dreadful anticipation that precedes it. Brides sensing they were not marrying but being delivered. Children who avoided mirrors, fearing they would see pinched, unfamiliar reflections watching them from behind their own eyes. Servants creeping past closed rooms only to hear laughter long after the victim was buried. And the most chilling testimonies are the ones that suggest the victims never truly left. That vitality, once taken, lingered like a haunting parasite in the survivor. In New Haven in 1877, a doctor wrote of his observations of a patient, an aging senator whose vigor returned inexplicably after his daughter's sudden collapse at 18. The senator's eyes had changed. "They hold two lights," the doctor noted, one his own and one bright, girlish, as though a second consciousness resides just behind. The implication is unbearable, that transplantation was not just a matter of energy, but also an awareness that the smiles of fathers bore faint traces of their vanished children. Pause here and consider that possibility. Margaret Hale's collapse not only surrendered her youth to others, it may have imprisoned her consciousness within them, suffocating inside borrowed flesh. And if that's so, then each witness who described a father or groom appearing too calm was not observing indifference. They were observing possession. They were seeing the bloom take root within the beneficiary, carrying the victim's essence with it, trapped forever. The psychological horror of this cannot be overstated. Imagine being Elias Hale, walking stronger after his daughter's death, hearing faint laughter in his lungs that was not his own. Imagine being Thomas Radcliffe, lying in bed after burying a bride he never loved, yet waking with tics and quirks familiar only to her. Imagine being one of their guests, watching their renewed glow and realizing that vitality you had once toasted in Margaret was now reanimating her father's hands. The circle cloaked its rituals in progress, telling itself it was collecting bloom, preserving greatness. But what it preserved was torment. Endless imprisonment of fragments of souls ripped from bodies too young, too innocent. Every ledger, every line, balance carried forward, was less accountancy than captivity. Another human presence pinned inside a body not its own. If ghosts walk, perhaps this is why. Because they cannot rest, their energy is stolen, circulated, and recycled beyond recognition. Margaret's ghost is described as wandering through windows, her gown flickering in the shadows. But what if that ghost is not an apparition? What if it is only residual bloom, still clawing for release out of hosts who fattened themselves upon her radiance? This was the true human cost of the circle. Not death alone, but psychological violation, identity stolen, agency erased, memory trapped, looping inside unwilling vessels. To imagine Margaret whispering at that final moment, "Father promised me," is to understand she knew exactly where she was going, into him, and so the system consumed the very love it claimed to protect. Fathers who swore to shield their children ended by feasting upon them. Grooms who vowed to cherish instead devoured. Institutions that prided themselves on progress achieved it by imprisoning the very future they claimed to serve. All the while, the stewards congratulated themselves for defeating decay, their journals brimming with pride. Yet for the victims, eternity was not liberation, but a cage. That is why the testimonies ring so dreadful. They do not speak of ghosts wanting vengeance. They speak of whispers begging release. "Let us break," Susanna said through a medium in a transcript years later. "Please let this cage break." Margaret Hale's story is not just about a dead bride in Virginia. It is about a system that built prosperity upon human vessels. And if the silence of servants and mothers had not cracked in scattered letters, we might never know it existed. But the cracks are there. Clara's Bible letter, Anna's sister's correspondence, Rebecca's ash-flecked gown. Together they cry louder than the circle ever intended. And what they cry is this: preservation is a lie. The circle's pursuit of permanence preserved nothing except their own terror of loss. The true inheritance of the Hale tragedy is not a secret of science, but the psychological ruin of families taught to consume instead of grieve. History moves like water. It changes shape, flowing around obstacles, carving new paths through stone, yet it never truly vanishes. It only shifts form, and so it was with the circle of perpetuity. Though their plantation halls crumbled in war and fire, though the names Hale and Fenwick fell quiet beneath the dust of forgotten records, the essence of their pact survived. It flowed north, it clothed itself in science, and it wore new masks polished with benevolence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were an age of reform, philanthropy, and progress, or so the papers called them. Rockefellers, Carnegies, Morgans, men who wrapped their legacies in hospitals, universities, and laboratories. It was the new religion of wealth cleansed by contribution. Yet in the shadows, what if this philanthropy was not redemption at all, but camouflage? What if the same philosophy that consumed Margaret Hale, that life was currency, that bloom could be harvested and banked, changed its language, printing pamphlets instead of ledgers, patents instead of parchments, but carrying forward the same balance and debt? Consider the case of the Radcliffe Institute for Vital Studies, founded in Boston in 1903. In official records, it was established to study cellular regeneration and aging, a forward-leaning branch of biology that would later become genetics. Its inaugural paper promised a new era of longevity science, where the borders of natural mortality might be extended. Notice the language: extended, not ended, and preserved, not healed. Within those careful words lay the circle's old obsession: freezing, preserving, suspending time itself. And consider its funding. The largest donor was none other than the Radcliffe line, direct descendants of Thomas Radcliffe himself, the husband who watched Margaret die over her wedding table without shedding a tear. By 1905, the Institute employed several European scientists whose work drew directly upon theories of vital transference. One experiment, recorded in surviving drafts, described extracting cellular energy from rabbits at the moment of their death by means of acoustic resonance. Another paper, handwritten but never published, referenced something even stranger: residuum psyches, contained fragments of consciousness present in transfused animals, observable in momentary twitching as though the original life still whispered from within the vessel. Bloom, given new vocabulary. In 1910, Boston newspapers reported a curious story. A fire ravaged the upper floor of the Radcliffe Institute, destroying records and killing 3 assistants. Officially, it was an accident. However, a private investigator hired by local families penned an unpublished report, which was later discovered among his papers. He described finding shattered cages, the feathers of exotic birds strewn across the ruins, and broken phonographs designed not to play melodies, but to emit piercing tonal frequencies. These were no ordinary laboratories, he wrote. These were the rooms of the Fellowship, updated and disguised. The sacrifice remains the same. Only the instruments have changed. By the 1920s, the Circle no longer relied on rituals whispered in oak chambers. It relied on research grants, peer-reviewed articles, and laboratories. But if you read between the lines, the continuity is undeniable. Where Elias Hale had scribbled balance carried forward, policy documents now read, vital credit retained. Where he whispered of preservation, scientists spoke of prolonged stasis. Where once cages rattled with nightingales, now machines buzzed with ultrasonic tones. The aesthetic had modernized. The hunger had not, and always, there were victims. In 1926, in a New York hospital quietly funded by Circle-linked endowments, a girl named Abigail Morgan was admitted for nervous exhaustion. Over the next week, her health declined swiftly, though records note no physical cause. Nurses later confessed privately that her room was visited nightly by physicians wheeling in curious apparatus. Her family was told she died peacefully. Yet one nurse, racked with guilt, recorded her final words: "He promised me." The exact phrase whispered by Margaret nearly 80 years before. Coincidence? Or the Circle's refrain, whispered by every victim who understood too late the fate bargained for them. And as always, as one girl faded, another man thrived. Within months, a Morgan patriarch once written off as near death appeared revitalized, presiding over banking meetings with vigor that startled colleagues. Whispers around the hospital were quietly buried under new wings and charitable donations. Who would accuse those offering such generosity? And yet, all the while, Bloom was being banked. The psychological mastery of the Circle lay in this transformation. By cloaking their exchanges in progress and philanthropy, they not only escaped scrutiny, but also acquired admiration. Where once they silenced servants with stipends, now they silence nations with scholarships. Who dares question hospitals that heal thousands when only a handful vanish in the shadows of their basements? Who challenges universities that educate millions when only a few students die suddenly in tragic accidents each decade? The scale of good became the camouflage for the currency of Bloom. The Circle, you see, never needed believers. It needed beneficiaries. And with every doctor trained, every student awarded, every hospital wing filled, the beneficiaries multiplied. Whether consciously or not, they became stewards too, accepting the bargain, looking away from cracks in the facade, soothing themselves with the mantra of progress, and the symbols remained. The serpent in college crests. The broken circle is embedded subtly in stained glass windows. At first dismissed as harmless motifs, they reveal their continuity only when traced along the lattice connecting centuries. The same serpent Elias Hale scrawled in his ledger appears, stylized, in emblems of 20th century institutions. Coincidence? Or quiet declaration, stamped upon buildings like ownership seals? This world belongs to us, and Margaret? She became less a person, more a prototype. The records of her collapse served as proof to those in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The method works. A young bride radiant with bloom, extinguished in an instant. Her energy preserved, transferred, transmuted. She was the circle's first public demonstration. Each act thereafter was simply a refinement. Pause here and ask, when you see the photographs of philanthropists from the 1920s and 1930s, those who smile with wrinkleless faces into their 70s, are you certain what preserved them was good fortune? Or was it Margaret and Susanna and Abigail and all the unnamed others whose bloom was siphoned for their sake? Progress, perhaps, but progress purchased in blood. By 1950, whispers of prolonged stasis surfaced again, this time in government-funded programs. Ochre files declassified in fragments mention human vitality experiments justified under the banner of wartime exigencies. The circle's hunger intersected with national ambition. If bloom could preserve generals, if it could extend the productive life of industrialists, then it could win wars, build empires. What began as a ghost story in Virginia now pulsed through the veins of nations, and still, the psychological prison of victims echoed. Nurses spoke of patients who whispered in sleep, "The future is today. It is always today." Exactly what Margaret had been reported to say in her endless loop. How many voices were trapped, cycling, jailed in stillness, feeding masters they never chose? By the 1970s, fertility clinics and genetic research centers took the circle's obsession further. No longer limited to the sudden collapse of brides, they sought controlled harvest. Failures were veiled as infant mortality or routine genetic disorders. Mothers accepted explanations with grief, never guessing that their losses may have been part of balances tallied in boardrooms. A chilling continuity. Bloom harvested, bloom transferred, bloom disguised, and above all, balance carried forward. So where did it begin? Margaret Hale's wedding. But where does it end? You will have to decide for yourself as we turn to the present. But the horror remains. What if the world you know is only the mask upon this deeper machinery? Hospitals, universities, charities, all noble, all glorious. But beneath the surface, what if the serpent still coils, patient as ever, feeding not on crops or coin, but on time itself? Margaret Hale became Virginia's ghost bride not because she was unique, but because she was first. The ledger's first balance was openly collected. The system only refined itself after her, seeking perfection, seeking secrecy. She is less a story of past tragedy than she is the cornerstone of a living structure. And if that is true, then every time you see an endowment, a miracle cure, a fortune carried intact across centuries, ask yourself, whose bloom, whose life, was sacrificed to preserve it? Imagine the wedding table once more, the glasses raised, the scent of roasted pheasant twisted with candle wax. The laughter of guests echoes through the hall. Margaret Hale stands, 17, radiant, unknowing yet resigned, her fate sealed long before her hand touched the stem of her glass. Her collapse is swift, silent, merciless. The confusion around her is frantic. But the eyes of Elias and Thomas tell a different story. In their stillness, their restraint, in the almost imperceptible flicker of acknowledgement, they are not surprised. They are satisfied. From that moment, Margaret ceased to be a girl. She became a precedent. What fell into silence in that Virginia hall was not innocence alone, but the final barrier against the circle's expansion. The wedding became the ledger's proof of concept, the origin story of bloom harvesting. And Margaret? She became its unwilling prophet. Every sacrifice thereafter, the Fenwick bride, the coiner daughter at her altar, the patients in Philadelphia wards, the whispers from asylums in Boston, every single one traces its lineage back to her folded gown and her fallen toast. How easy it is to consign this to myth, to sigh and say ghost stories stretch too far, and yet when we look around we see the footprints, the serpents on the glass windows, the strangely ageless faces of dynasties whose wealth never wanes, the charitable trusts whose names echo century after century, yet beneath them, sudden disappearances, inexplicable tragedies, youthful deaths so easily brushed aside. Too many coincidences, too many balanced ledgers were closed without explanation. The machinery has changed. The cages and birds gave way to laboratories and frequencies. The candlelit rituals gave way to boardrooms and sterile white tiles. But listen closely, and you hear the same cadence echoed. The vows of permanence, the obsession with preservation, the conviction that a few must fade so others endure. The circle never died. It only dressed itself in new clothes, philanthropy, progress, and reform. But progress built upon theft remains theft. Reform built upon sacrifice remains rot gilded with gold. What of Margaret's soul? If Bloom carried fragments of consciousness, then she may linger still, within bloodlines, in archives, in whispers, in the inexplicable dread that hangs around institutions touched by the circle. Her ghost is not the kind that rattles windows or knocks glasses. Her ghost is subtler. It's the crack you sense in the stone of the system. The knowledge, deep in your gut, that something is off. That time is not flowing naturally. That preservation you admire hides a hollow bargain. Margaret's ghost is not in the Hale ruins. It is in you, now aware, now awakened, carrying the weight of this truth forward. Consider this possibility. The circle's greatest achievement is not merely extending years, but extending influence. What if those who fed upon Bloom are not gone? What if their vitality, drawn from Margaret and others, still fuels descendants today? What if the families whose names dominate our corporations and shape our governments are not simply heirs of fortune, but heirs of Bloom purchased through sacrifices like hers? It is a chilling idea. But ask yourself honestly, does it explain more than it obscures? Does it not fit the strange preservation of dynasties, the uncanny repetition of names across centuries, the hollow but continuous glow of families, too enduring to be natural? If so, then Margaret's fall was the template, the first installment of a debt we still carry. And her whisper, "Father promised me," was not just a plea, but a prophecy. Fathers promised daughters, grooms promised brides, families promised sacrifices, and the circle promised itself eternity. The tragedy is that Margaret might still be imprisoned, if not in body, then in resonance. Victims described looping consciousness, trapped within stolen Bloom. If true, then each ounce of vitality extracted carried with it the faint echo of its origin, which means Margaret and her sisters across time still linger, suffocating within the Bloom that purchased another's vigor, forever conscious, forever silent. The circle called this preservation. But what is eternity if it is only awareness without freedom? That is not victory over death. That is death multiplied. Pause here and let the horror bloom fully before you. A system that feeds on daughters. A legacy hiding beneath universities, hospitals, and trusts. A fellowship refined but unrepentant, alive not in plantations but in corporations, not in chapels but in clinics. If Margaret was folded like an entry in a ledger, then how many other names now swirl unseen beneath your feet, locked inside the foundations of our world? But let us not end with despair. For despair is exactly the prison the circle would prefer not to be. Instead, end with fire. End with light. Margaret's story resurfaced not by their will, but despite it. Elias tried to hide the ledgers. Servants were threatened. Letters were burned. Yet fragments survived anyway. Clara's testimony tucked in a Bible. Anna's letters spared by chance. Ledgers preserved in cracked trunks. Truth bleeds through, always. Every time the circle tried to erase, the cracks widened. Now those cracks converge here in your ears as you listen. You are bearing witness. And if Bloom can flow from victim to steward, then perhaps truth can flow from the past to you, into courage that breaks this cycle. Understand this. Secrecy is their greatest shield. And knowledge is the one weapon secrecy cannot withstand. Margaret's glass shattered in 1847, but her truth did not. It passed silently forward. Now it rests with you. So ask yourself, will you let her become only a ghost story, a curiosity locked in archives? Or will you turn her collapse into a light bright enough to expose the circle's shadow wherever it lurks? This is not just history, it is a responsibility. Families traded their own daughters for power. Fathers became predators. And yet, even through generations of erasure, the victims' whispers reached us. They wanted freedom. They tried to break. Do not let their whispers fade into silence again. The circle of perpetuity thrived because men feared mortality more than they loved their children. Break that cycle by choosing otherwise. Please share this story. Let its weight ripple forward. Let its cracks widen until no mask of philanthropy can cover what they have built. If Margaret's Bloom was stolen, then let her memory bloom anew as something else, not imprisonment, but rebellion. A bride who fell, yes, but a ghost who refuses to stay quiet. If you are still here now, listening, I ask you one thing. Do not turn away. Do not forget. Carry her truth. Carry their cries. And if the circle waits outside these walls still, then let it know this. Preservation is impossible, Eternity is a lie. Bloom stolen is bloom cursed. The only immortality that endures is memory, and memory is ours now, not theirs. Her fall was supposed to be the end of her story. Instead, it is the beginning of ours. We are the witnesses Elias never wanted to be. We are the voices Clara dreamed of reaching. We are the balance carried forward. We are the serpent broken, and if this story gripped you, if you felt the horror of Margaret's glass rising before her collapse, then do not keep it inside. Remember what silence built. Remember how fear allowed the circle to thrive. Do not repeat their silence. Speak, share, shine light. That is how ghosts finally rest. That is how the bloom returns. So now I ask you, before this story vanishes into another night, subscribe. Because there are more hidden histories to tell, more ghosts demanding their names spoken aloud. Like this video, for each victim whose life was stolen before they could grow old. And comment below what you felt as you walked Margaret's wedding hall with us. Because together, we are no longer just listeners. We are the resistance to erasure. The circle fears exposure more than death. Because exposure is death. Let us deliver it. Let Margaret's ghost finally bloom in the open air.